everyone, welcome back to this week's episode of VetFolio Voice. This episode is sponsored by Boehringer Ingelheim and features Dr. Dawn Booth. I love talking to Dr. Booth. She is just an encyclopedia of knowledge when it comes to veterinary pharmacology, and I'm not exaggerating when I say my previous talks with her have truly impacted and really changed the way that I practice, particularly in regards to my choices of when, and maybe more importantly, how I use different pharmaceuticals when I'm managing different conditions in my patients. In this episode, we tackle the alphabet soup of compounding. I'll say prior to this conversation, I felt like I had a reasonable understanding of compounding and compounding laws, but in talking to Dr. Booth, who, as I mentioned before, just brings this extensive knowledge of pharmacology and regulation around medication use in veterinary patients, it became very clear that my knowledge just scratched the surface. Despite really working hard to be prepared for this conversation, reviewing a write-up by Dr. Booth that she was kind enough to share with me and having the opportunity to ask some baseline questions prior to our conversation at VMX, I still learned so much from our conversation here. Recently, we've really heard a lot around compounding and changes to compounding regulation, and like I mentioned before, it's kind of an alphabet soup. FDA, USDA, GFI, and in this talk we add 503A and 503B, but Dr. Booth did an amazing job of clarifying current laws and industry guidance around compounding and illustrating the differences between laws and guidance and compounding options. Okay, that's all I can say and still sound like I remotely know what I'm talking about, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Booth and let her do the heavy lifting of walking us through these current concepts around laws and regulation in veterinary compounding. Dr. Dawn Booth graduated from Texas A&M University in 1980 with her DVM. After an internship at Auburn University, she returned to TAMU for a master's in physiology, residency in small animal internal medicine, where she became a diplomate in 1985, and a PHRMA fellowship and PhD in veterinary clinical pharmacology. She's among the first class of the American College of Veterinary Clinical Pharmacology diplomates. In 1990, she joined the TAMU faculty in the Department of Veterinary Physiology and Pharmacology, reaching professor in 2003. She then joined the Auburn University College of Veterinary Medicine, Departments of Anatomy, Physiology, and Pharmacology and Clinical Sciences, where she directs the Auburn University Clinical Pharmacology Laboratory, which serves over 4,000 national and international practices and teaches first to fourth year students. She's mentored over 30 graduate students and residents, implemented as PI over $1.7 million in research, authored or co-authored over 125 peer-reviewed scientific publications, 2 textbooks, and over 60 book chapters. Major awards include an Achievement Award in Teaching from Texas A&M, the Jack Mara Scientific Achievement Award for Scientific Achievement, and at Auburn University, Graduate Student Mentor Awards, the Zoetis Award for Excellence in Research, and most recently, an Auburn University Alumni Professor and an ACVP Distinguished Service Award. All right, have I convinced you that she is the one to teach us about veterinary compounding? Let's jump in. Dr. Booth, thank you so much for joining me. I always have so much fun talking to you, and I learn so much. And, for everybody who is attending, if you enjoy this talk, I've spoken with Dr. Booth a couple of times, and she just really has changed the way I practice in some ways in terms of thinking about antimicrobial therapy and things like that. So I'm so excited to talk to you again.
Well, I'm glad to be here, and I'm going to tell you, this is one of probably the toughest subjects to talk about because we've been dealing with this for many years. There are so many complexities. We're talking about legal things. We're talking about practical things. So I'm really thankful to be here to see if I can't help iron out some questions.
Absolutely. I know just when we sat down to kind of go over the subject itself, I felt okay. I was like, I know what compounding is. And just in our conversation, I went, oh, no, actually, I have a lot of questions. So I'm really glad that we're sitting here and going to be able to bring that to listeners. Good. So let's start easy. What is a compounded product?
Yeah, so right away. I think to me it's easier to talk about what a compounded product is by talking about what it isn't. So most of the drugs that we use in animals, if not all of them, have gone through an approval process. They've been vetted. They're approved by the Food and Drug Administration, whether it's human or animal. That's important because that means that that drug, because of the manufacturers provided the data, has been well vetted regarding clinical efficacy and safety, and especially for the purposes of this discussion, quality. So that means that that product, when a veterinarian uses that product, they know without a doubt that every lot number is going to be the same in terms of potency, purity, and accuracy. So compounded products are not like that. Compounded products are intended for the individual patient, and it makes common sense that nobody's going to be able to afford to do all that science for a drug that's being given to a single patient. So that means that there's been no vetting, and there are issues maybe with efficacy and safety, but certainly the quality is something that we have to worry about as well. When we talk about compounding, I'm just going to remind people that it could start with taking a product that has been approved and you've diluted it. So you've taken it and you've manipulated it beyond that which is described in the package insert. Or it could be crushing a tablet and putting it in a solution so that you can get it down an NG tube. Or it could be a really sophisticated novel drug delivery system like a transdermal gel. But they're all examples of compounding because they're for an individual patient.
I think that's a good example of why there are so many questions surrounding it, because something as simple as crushing a pill to put it down an NG tube technically falls into this category. So, it's wide open for the types of drugs that fall into the category of compounded medication.
Exactly. Right.
So for clarification, compounding versus generic, what's the difference?
So that's another struggle we've had, right? Many of us had. So the simple answer is a generic drug is an approved drug. The difference between a generic drug and the pioneer drug. So the pioneer drug will be the first drug that was approved, the first formulation. The difference between the two is that the company that generated the pioneer drug established the clinical safety and efficacy of that drug, and they established the relationship between drug concentrations and time. Well, once that has been established, as long as another company can come along and show that their product has that same relationship between drug concentration and time, in other words, the same amount of drug gets into the patient at the same rate, then all that clinical safety and efficacy data is the same. So the difference between a generic drug and a pioneer drug is that it's gone through an abbreviated approval process because the company hasn't had to do all the field trials. Of course, for a compounded product, it's not a generic product because a compounded product has not undergone approval. A generic product has, and so it's been totally vetted, just like the pioneer drug will have been.
Sure, and more for mass distribution, so to speak, to give to multiple patients versus like a single patient for
so I think what the key here is that a generic drug is just an approved drug. The only difference between a generic drug and a pioneer drug is that it's been an abbreviated approval process because they haven't had to do the field trials. And you can see that if you pick up carprofen, Rimadyl versus a generic carprofen, if you look at the package inserts, they're going to be exactly the same because the data is relevant as long as the same amount of drug gets into the patient. It has nothing to do with a compounded product. A compounded product undergoes none of that vetting.
That makes sense. So when would it be appropriate to prescribe a compounded product?
So I'm going to try and answer that two ways. So let's talk about a veterinarian prescribing a compounded product and then a veterinarian actually compounding the product.
Sure.
So let's back up and let's remind ourselves, first of all, that veterinarians are legally allowed to do this. You are protected by law. And that law is AMDUCA, the Animal Medicinal Drug Clarification Use Act, which nobody likes to talk about. But that law impacts you every day because that law is the law that allows us as veterinarians to use drugs that are not approved in the target species, so extra label drug use.
Sure.
The requirement for extra label drug use is that you have a veterinary client-patient relationship. Well, that law also addresses compounding in veterinary medicine, and it not only tells us that we can do it, that we can use a compounded product, but it tells us the circumstances as to when. And that law, and I keep using that word law, that law was generated by Congress. So When the FDA regulates through MDUCA, they can only do it because Congress has told them that they need to do it. That law gives us the circumstances under which we can compound. And the circumstances are we can't meet the needs of our patient with a currently approved human or animal drug. Now, that law also allows us to compound. So you as veterinarians can compound. Pharmacists can compound, and veterinarians can compound. I'm not sure that it's really wise because, as we'll see, when a veterinarian gets ready to compound, they have to follow all the same rules and regulations that a pharmacist has to follow when they compound. And while the FDA regulates who can compound and the actual compounded product, it is the states that regulate how you compound. And the state laws can be pretty difficult and they are quite variable. And most of them do require that you follow United States Pharmacopoeia guidelines. Now I'm going to take a tangent here real fast. So the United States Pharmacopoeia, not many veterinarians remember that or think about it, but it impacts you every day as well. That group started way back in the 1800s when the only way we had access to drugs was compounding. They understood that what was being compounded in one state was probably totally different than what was being compounded in another state. And they said, we got to stop this. We're going to set some standards so that when physicians use these compounded products, they can have some confidence that there's some continuity among them. So they're a standard-setting organization. They are non-regulatory, but the FDA follows those standards. They set standards for approved drugs, but they also set standards for compounding. And many of you may be aware of that. You've heard things like Chapter 795 and Chapter 797. These are guidelines for compounding that the USP has promulgated, and most states now require anybody that does compounding to follow those guidelines. And that can be a problem because those guidelines may be difficult to match. For example, you have to have facilities that are specific for compounding some of the products, and most of us don't have those facilities in practice. You have to adhere to beyond use dates. Those are expiration dates for compounded products, and that's tough to do as well. So while you can compound, you might be much better off prescribing. And to remind us, you can prescribe as long as you can't meet the needs of your patient with the currently approved marketed human or animal drug.
Okay, now I'm going to go on a tangent because I'm like, this is what happens is I come up with more questions as we go, and that's why it's so
as well you should.
Well, good. I'm glad you feel that way because there's so much to learn. So for clarification, when you're talking about these standard settings for veterinarians who are compounding, what if we're talking about something as simple as crushing a pill or something like that? I mean, I don't picture anybody coming in and inspecting us for crushing pills.
And that's such a good question. So let me first of all, when we get there aren't compounding police. They're going to be running around and slapping your hands, right? And saying, oh, you did this and you shouldn't have. The FDA, who does regulate the compounded product and who can compound, is going to push the act of compounding and all those, even their regulations, off to the states. So it's the states that you have to make happy. And no, the State Board of Pharmacy is not going to come along if you have gone through the process of compounding a pill and giving it to your patient. They're going to be worried more about if you, as a compounder, start compounding intravenous solutions, for example, for a large number of patients, and those put your patients at risk. But this does give me an opportunity to remind you that the state boards of pharmacy and their interpretation of veterinary compounding are all over the board. And I don't mean that negatively, but the problem is if you live in Alabama, they don't even talk to us about compounding. There are no laws from the state boards of pharmacy in the state of Alabama for veterinarians. On the other hand, you can go into another state and they're going to be very strict about what veterinarians can compound and how they go about doing it. So it's a reminder that if you are going to compound, you need to look at your state boards of pharmacy and see what they tell you about what you need to be doing. Another good reason to maybe push the compounding off on a pharmacist so you don't have to worry about those rules and regulations. But the simple things, no, I don't think that you need to worry about that. That's a really good question.
Sure, sure. Okay, that makes me feel better because in general, I'm a play it safe kind of person. So
Yeah.
prescribing a compounded substance definitely
Right.
sounds like the way to go rather than
Right.
trying to make something myself. And then, of course, using, the drugs that are already available would be ideal, but it's just not always reality. So what are some of the situations where we would compound a drug?
So let me back up and let me say maybe a good way to answer that question is if you're compounding for your patient, I wouldn't worry about it. But if you're compounding for somebody else's patient and somebody else is going to take the product that you have made, then I would probably worry about what the state boards of pharmacy are saying.
Okay.
It's that to me would be the way to discriminate. And I'm sorry, your next question was.
Oh no, that's actually really helpful. Thank you. So next question was basically when would we compound? It seems like a much safer bet to use the drugs that are available, but because that's just not always possible with our patients, what are some of the examples of situations where compounding would be necessary?
That's a really good question. So let's back up when you can't meet the needs of your patient with a currently approved product. So there's lots of situations where we find ourselves dealing with a need for compounding. The best example is our dogs. We got dinky Yorkies, we got giant Great Danes, right? And so these little bitty guys can't use the same pills that the big guys can. And it's not easy to break something up accurately in tenths or even thirds. So that would be an example of where compounding would be expected. Sometimes the drug's not there. I've got a cat that needs metronidazole. It is not going to take metronidazole hydrochloride, but it will take metronidazole benzoate. There's not an approved form of that in the United States. So that is an example of when compounding can take place. Cisapride is another example. We don't have cisapride in the United States anymore, so that could be compounding. Another good example is I have an approved product, but it has something in it that my patient can't tolerate. Patient has atopy. It's got beef flavoring in it as a excipient. That's not going to work. It's a dog. It's got xylitol in it. That's not going to work. And then there's always, I have 5 cats. I know that some of them will take a pill and some of them will not. We might think it's dangerous to pill some animals, but it is. It might sound a little bit strange, but yes, some animals just simply can't be pilled. That would be a legitimate reason to have something compounded to a formulation that is more tolerable for the patient. And there's other examples as well.
Sure. I think cats are a really powerful example. You got to get real creative with them.
Yeah, we do. But I'm also going to point out as we talk about compounding and the issues, just because we need to be creative does not mean that the product that is created is going to work for our patient.
Sure. And actually, on that note, I wanted to talk about cisapride because I had one patient that I'm thinking of who did great on cisapride and really needed it. But with it not being available in the United States, I would imagine they're not taking a commercially available form of cisapride and transforming that into a compounded medication. Would that be an example of compounding from bulk?
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about what bulk substances are, because that really has led to a lot of the confusion regarding what's allowed, what's not allowed from the FDA standpoint. So if we go back to that law, AMDUCA, which protects our right of extra label drug use and protects our right of compounding, well, the FDA, and I'm going to put a plug in here for the FDA, they have a tough road to follow. They have 2 bosses that are really tough to make happy. One of them's Congress. And what Congress tells them to do, they have to do. So they have to regulate that law. They have to regulate it to the best of their ability. The other boss is us, and we are a tough boss. They have to make us happy as well, and they have to protect our patients as well as people. So when they back up and they recognize that there is a need for compounding from bulk, and let's define a bulk substance. A bulk substance is basically the active pharmaceutical ingredient. So I have a dry substance, let's say it's cisapride. It doesn't come in a finished dosing form. The FDA wants us to compound from finished dosing forms, and they want us to do that because they understand that compounded products are associated with a whole host of risks, including issues of quality. And they think that if you start with a product that's already been vetted through the approval process, then it's off to a good start. So it's harder for there to be problems with that product. The problem is they also understand that you can't make an ocular solution for a cat with an approved pill. I don't have metronidazole benzoate. We don't have cisapride. So they've nodded their head and they said, we understand there are going to be situations that require compounding from bulk. The problem is the law states specifically in there, nothing in this law shall be construed as allowing compounding from bulk. So we have this law that the FDA must regulate that says, we didn't say you could compound from bulk. Doesn't say it's illegal, just says you can't compound from bulk. Then we have all the people that say we really need to compound from bulk, and because they didn't say it's illegal, then it means it must be legal, so we're going to go ahead and do it. So there's been a whole bunch of compounding from bulk, and that worries the FDA. So compounding from bulk substances causes them concern for a variety of reasons, and among them are, human and animal safety, compounding of drugs for food animals, because when you eat food animals, then that exposes you to them. And then the FDA does not like the idea of being able to compound from bulk if you're going to copy something that's already approved. And that happens. Piracy would be the word. And they're also a little bit worried about office stock. So the FDA will step back and they will expect the compounded product to be made from an approved dosing form, but they understand that there are situations where that can't happen, and cisapride's an example of that. So what they have done is they've tried to balance the risks and benefits, and they said, okay, under certain circumstances, we will follow regulatory discretion. We will allow this compounding from a bulk substance to occur as long as certain criteria are met. And those criteria will be delineated to make sure that we don't do things like inappropriately compound food animal products or inappropriately copy a commercial product. So cisapride would be a good example of where the FDA would they would impart regulatory discretion. They wouldn't turn their heads so much as they'll say, okay, we'll do this and we're not going to regulate this product.
So the FDA, it's kind of gray as far as where the concern is going to be, but theoretically, if you have a reasonable justification for why you need this product and why it's compounded from bulk, then they should have regulatory discretion and say, okay, we're going to let you do that.
They will, and we'll probably get to talking about GFI, but let me back up and remind the audience there are reasons to not compound for bulk beyond just the exposure to people of drugs and food animals of drugs. But lots of things can go wrong with a compounded product, and we know that. We've seen that happen. Mathematical errors are probably the easiest to understand, and we've seen that, for example, with horses, the polo horses in Ocala. A product was being compounded that was intended to mimic a dietary supplement. 100 times the amount of selenium got in there, and it killed the herd. We saw that, we heard that signal because so many horses were impacted, but there's probably a lot of times that happens and we just don't realize it. And I'm going to point out that the other end of the spectrum is also a problem. It's not always just too much drug, but sometimes it's too little. I personally, as a clinician, have had to deal with a patient that went into seizures because the compounded anti-seizure med had 0 to very little drug in it, and that patient went into seizures as well. And then there's stability issues. The one other example I'm going to use is omeprazole, Gastrogard in horses. It's available over the counter and is a prescription-based product in a paste. It was deemed potentially too expensive by some, and compounding pharmacists realized that they could compound a paste very similar to the commercial product, much, much cheaper. And so they started doing that, but the problem was the omeprazole is pH balanced, and the pH of that product was inappropriate, and what ended up happening was therapeutic failure in a host of horses. They developed gastric ulcers. So there are reasons for compounding from bulk should be avoided, not just because of the exposure to people and food animals, but when you're compounding a large volume, those mistakes tend to be magnified and reach many patients.
Yeah, and the horse example is very near and dear to my heart. Yeah. That was my exit from vet school, where it wasn't that specific case. Although I do remember that when that happened, it was I can't remember what was compounded, but we had a whole lot of, I think we had
3 or 4 off the track thoroughbreds who were neurologic, and it was very scary.
Sad. And just in general, there have been multiple studies, both in human medicine and veterinary medicine, and they're independent studies, and there are also FDA studies where they've looked at the amount of drug in compounded products and compared it to what's supposed to be in there. And in general, these studies show that compounded products do not fare well. And so when the FDA steps in and says, we'd really rather you not use a compounded product unless it's these circumstances, there's good reason for that.
And just to clarify, if we are starting with a commercially approved product, not compounding from bulk, does that offer a guarantee that we're going to get therapeutic failure or good bioavailability? What does that tell us about the final product?
That's another really good question. So let's say you start with a good product, and let's say the product was compounded absolutely perfectly. Even then, for me, I worry about things like novel dosing forms. And one of my good rules of thumb is just because you can make it doesn't mean you should. Sure. Just because the pharmacist says they can make it and you tell them to doesn't mean it's going to work. So I already mentioned transdermal gels. We know the skin is a tough organ to penetrate, and yet we still see a lot of transdermal gels offering a whole host of different drugs. That's an example of a novel drug delivery system that really should not be used unless that system has been demonstrated to be an effective way of delivering drugs. And let me take it one step further. Here's one of the problems about compounding products. Even if a study has been done with a specific formulation that has been compounded, let's say it's an extended release or a transdermal gel, that study is only good for that preparation that follows that recipe. If you deviate from that recipe with a different transdermal gel, with a different excipient, that study no longer applies to the rest of the patients. And that's why it's so hard to validate that a compounded product is going to work, because every single product needs to be studied independently.
Sure, which would just be completely unrealistic to actually pull off those types of studies.
That's
right. Absolutely. That's right. Well, I think you've done a great job of kind of demonstrating why the FDA has concerns about compounding from bulk. So can we talk about the justification? We've talked about we have to have a reason why we're compounding from bulk. Is that something that we need to generate as veterinarians and we need to document in our records?
Yeah, so and now let's do this. Let's start talking about the new GFI, the GFI 256. Everybody may be aware of the new guidelines that the FDA has promulgated. So I'm just going to remind you, as the FDA has struggled to balance the risk versus benefits of compounding, especially compounding from bulk, they've tried to tell their constituents, this is what we think needs to happen, and this is how we think we're going to regulate this. And they've published this information in the form of what used to be called compliance guidelines, policy guidelines. Now they're called guidances for industry. So these are non-legally binding, but they're intended to share with pharmacists, veterinarians, the current way of thinking. And many of them have focused on trying to explain when they're going to tolerate compounding from bulk and when they're not. So just a little bit of history of the GFI 256, okay? So this is an issue in people as well. In people, the FDA has struggled to try and regulate compounding. The law in people, the Drug and Cosmetic Act in 1996 addresses compounding, and that section of the law is called 503A. So it's a 503A section of the law. That law is what allows pharmacists to compound. And so we refer to those as 503A pharmacies. So the FDA's not been able to not legitimately, but they've not been able to effectively regulate compounding to the point that they'd like to in people. And what happened in 2012 and 2013 is a product, a steroid that needed to be injected, was compounded by a pharmacy in New England. They'd been cited for problems previously, but they were still compounding. And what ended up happening is one or a couple batches of their glucocorticoid got contaminated with a fungus, and people were treated with that. 700 people got sick, 60 people died. And when that happened, Congress finally understood that the current law was not going to be good enough to help regulate compounding in humans. And so they wrote a new law. And that new law was the Drug Quality and Safety Act of 2013. And what that law did, it is allowed for the formulation of what are called 503B pharmacies. And they're called that because that section of the law is 503B. So those 503B pharmacies, and they're not pharmacies, I should not call them that, they are outsourcing facilities. And the reason it's important to make that distinction is because they are allowed to compound large amounts of a product in anticipation, not for an individual patient, but in anticipation. But they have strict rules. They have to follow good manufacturing processes. They have to report to the FDA. They can't compound from bulk unless the drug is on the list. All sorts of things that are intended to make that product in humans a quality product. Well, that law could apply to animals, but the Food and Drug Administration stepped back and they said, we don't think so. We think it's going to present too much of a risk. We don't want this 503B portion of the law to apply to animals. But there's some good things in there that should apply to animals. We don't really know how to handle that, so we're going to reach out to the profession. And so what they did is exactly that. They reached out to the AVMA. The AVMA got together a council of specialists, clinical pharmacologists, pharmacists, feline practitioners, zoo practitioners, internal medicine, and they sat around the table. They looked at the 503B law. They looked at the AMDUCA. They looked at what we needed as practitioners to effectively deliver drugs safely to our patients. They made recommendations to Congress, which in turn made it to FDA, and they listened. They read all of that. They came up with a new set of guidelines. They published them. The public responded. They went, oh, well, maybe we better fix this. And they came up with the GFI 256. So GFI 256 is intended to share with constituents, pharmacists and veterinarians, the current way that the FDA is going to approach regulating compounding of animal drugs from bulk. And that's an important thing to hear. If you compound from a finished dosing form, we don't need to worry about that. But if you're compounding from bulk, they now have this new set of guidelines that are intended to help pharmacists and veterinarians understand when it is okay to compound from bulk and when it is not. Now, I'm not sure if that answered your question.
It gave me more questions as usual. And now here I'm going to go off on my tangent. First off, okay, so 503A and 503B both considered outsourcing facilities, not
so
referring to them as
503A was the original Food and Drug Cosmetic Act that allowed for drug approval by the FDA, allowed pharmacists to compound. So that's all 503A. When Congress said, we need to fix compounding and we can't seem to do it effectively within the 503A law, well, we're going to write a new law. So that new law is 503B. And that new law allowed for the formation of these outsourcing facilities. So we referred to 503A pharmacies, that's your mom and pop or CVS or Walgreens, and then the 503B outsourcing facilities. The 503B outsourcing facilities have much more stringent rules. Now, they will make a quality product. They will follow GMP. You can be confident that if they've made this product, that it's a pure product and it's an accurate product. Does not necessarily mean it's going to work, but at least it's a quality product. One of the problems, though, is they cannot compound from bulk. So the FDA, they said, okay, here's a new guidance for pharmacies and veterinarians. What we're thinking about compounding of animal drugs from bulk, they're only going to pertain to 503A pharmacies. So that means that 503B outsourcing facilities don't have the luxury of compounding from bulk. They've not been given permission. It's only the 503A pharmacies or veterinarians that compound from bulk that are potentially given the permission under these certain circumstances.
Okay, so the 503Bs are compounding from commercially available.
No, they're going to be allowed to compound, not manufacture, compound large amounts of a product. So these products don't undergo safety and efficacy.
Sure.
They follow GMP, good manufacturing practices, so that means their accuracy and precision will be good. Their quality will be good. They have to follow USP standards. And they can make large batches in advance, so they can send these out to large numbers of people.
And can they do that from bulk?
If it's from a list.
Okay.
And that's going to bring us to GFI, because that's a really important distinction of the GFI. So the GFI, the Guidance for Industry 256, is all about telling practitioners, pharmacists, whoever, when the FDA is going to allow compounding of animal drugs from bulk.
Okay.
It only applies to 503A pharmacies.
Got it.
It does not apply to 503B.
Okay, I understand. Thank you for going back and clarifying that again.
And it's really hard to understand. Now, I'm going to tell you that some states do allow 503B outsourcing facilities to compound for animals, and that makes it a little bit difficult. But if we look at the Guidance for Industries, and let's do that, there are going to be some restrictions.
Absolutely. This might not fall into that same category, so if we need to put a pin in this for a minute, that's completely fine. But, I'm thinking of a compounding, I'm assuming it would be a 503A pharmacy in my area that I have utilized from time to time. I have no idea where the drug is coming from that they are compounding for my patient. So if that's something we need to put to the side and
No, it's part of GFI. So
Okay.
that's exactly what GFI is intended to do. So the Guidance for Industry is for pharmacists. It's for the compounder. So if you don't compound, you really don't need to worry much about this, because it's the compounder's responsibility to go back to you as the practitioner and say, look, I need this, this, and this before I can make this product. Okay. So the Guidance for Industry, a couple of points about it. GFI 256, it's only for bulk substances. So if you are talking about compounding from an approved finished dosing form, don't worry about this. You can just set it aside. It is intended to minimize exposure to drugs for people and for food animals. And so because of that, there's kind of two separate guidelines, one for food-producing animals and one for non-food producing animals. So we'll focus on the non-food producing animals because that's what most of us are here for.
Sure.
And then the other thing to remember about the GFI is it's largely the responsibility of the compounder to make sure that the rules are followed. Okay, so I'm going to use some examples. The last thing that I need to point out is the GFI is going to address compounding for individual patients. But remember, way back I told you one of the things that the FDA is worried about is compounding for office stock as well. Sure. So office stock is something that you have on your shelf. You plan on using it to treat a patient right then and right there. And sometimes you'll send the patient home with it until you can get a prescription filled. Now, some states don't allow veterinarians to do that. So, we're going to come back to state boards of pharmacy and remind you need to check about that. But the FDA wants to be real careful about allowing compounding for office stock as well. So in the GFI, they kind of have two parallel flows. One is for drugs compounded from bulk for the individual patient, and one is for compounding for office stock. So let's talk about compounding of drugs from bulk for animal patients that are not food-producing animals. So the first thing that you'll need to ask yourself, according to the GFI, is, does it meet the need? Can I meet the needs of my patient with an approved product? And if the answer is yes, then you're not going to get regulatory discretion. The FDA is going to say, nope, you shouldn't be doing that. If it doesn't, then the next question you have to ask yourself is the product that I want compounded for my patient going to be similar in terms of the route of administration to the commercially available approved product? And so let's use, for example, methimazole. Let's say we need to administer methimazole orally in a cat and I want it to be compounded. Well, oral methimazole is approved for use in the cat, so you can't.
Sure.
But let's say the cat can't take it orally, it has to take it transdermally. Well, there is not a transdermal methimazole. We know it works. We've got data to establish that. According to the GFI, it's a different route of administration. The FDA is going to say, yep, that's okay. Okay. So let's go to pimabendin. Pemabendin has been compounded from bulk substances to make tiny tabs for quite some time now, okay? Well, let's say you want to continue that in a patient. So you go back. The problem is you can meet the needs of your patient with the commercially available product. But let's say that the patient can't tolerate the beef that's in there. So as long as you can justify why you can't use that commercially available product, even if you're given it the same route and you provide that information to the pharmacist, the FDA will say it's okay. And so they will allow it. So the pharmacist will be the one reaching out to you and saying, hey, I need to know why you need to give this orally compounded product, even though there's one that's commercially available. Tell me what it is so I can put it on the prescription and we're good to go.
And essentially the onus is on the compounder to say, hey, if we're going to do this, then we have to make sure that we have it justified.
Because they're going to be the ones that are regulated if we fail to. You can help the compounding pharmacist out by putting it on the prescription ahead of time. Now, for office stock, there's that other arm of GFI, and this is where the rub comes along. So the FDA has said, just like in human medicine, if you want to compound something from bulk for office stock, it can only be done if it's on a list. And this list is the list that the FDA has generated. And it's based upon applications by pharmacists, veterinarians. They've said, hey, FDA, we think we need to have metronidazole benzoate compounded from bulk for cats. These are the reasons why. So the FDA has this long list of about 100 different products that are being requested to be on the list. They will look at it, they will vet it for a true need, and then they'll make the decision, yes, there really is a need, or no, you can meet the needs of your patient with an approved human or animal product, so we're not going to list it. And I'm going to use Pemabendin as an example again. So if you look at that list, and everybody can access the list, they're published. Pemabendin has been submitted for consideration for oral formulations for dogs. The FDA has looked at those applications. They have deemed that we can meet the needs of the canine patients with the commercially available product, and so they have not listed Pemabendin to be compounded from bulk for office use. Now, this is just office use.
Okay.
So for office stock, the drug has to be on a list, and currently there are about 20 drugs that have been listed. There are about 20 drugs that have been reviewed, and they've said no. And there's probably about another 100 to be considered.
And like you said, we're talking about compounding from bulk for office use.
Stock.
So,
right.
If we have a pet who can't tolerate the beef flavoring, still okay to compound for an individual patient.
That's right. You follow the other arm of that pathway. You just need to justify it if it's similar to the commercially available product and similar to the same route. And I'm going to tell you, the GFI has done a really good job showing examples of what's justifiable and what's not. And they talk about allergies, they talk about toxins, they talk about unsafe dosing a patient. They also tell you what's not acceptable, and that's going to be cost and preference. So if Mrs. Smith says, gee, I really like those tiny tabs to dose Fifi, that's not a good enough reason. But if Mrs. Smith says, Fifi's going to bite me if I don't have this solution, then that's a justification.
So I'm really glad that you said that, because that was going to be my other question is, what about cost being a factor?
So forever, cost has never been a justification for compounding from bulk, never. And the FDA has been much more adamant about stipulating that in these GFI. Can I say one more thing?
Absolutely.
So I'm just going to remind the audience here, I'm beginning to see pushback from some of the 503B outsourcing facilities saying that they don't have to follow the rules and they don't have to necessarily they can compound from bulk, and also their beyond use states can be longer than the 503A pharmacies. Just remember that these GFIs do not apply to 503B outsourcing facilities, and that means, therefore, they don't really have permission to compound from bulk. And they are going to be required to follow USP rules, and those rules are going to be the same for beyond use states, regardless if it's a 503A pharmacy that's compounding from bulk or if it's a 503B outsourcing facility that's compounding from bulk. So the sets of rules are the same.
Okay. Well, Dr. Booth, I'm so glad that we sat down and had this conversation because we had our initial conversation. I read a lot of the stuff that we talked about. I was still going, I don't know if I have my head wrapped around this, but this conversation, I know for me, has been really helpful in clarifying a lot of those questions. So I hope that's the case for everybody out there. And I had a great time. I hope you did too.
Well, I appreciate the questions. This is a tough subject, a really tough subject.
It is. And I don't think I appreciated how nuanced, I guess is the word, it was before we started talking. And there's a lot to it.
Well, thank you so much. It's been great
you.
to be here. Thank you, everybody.
All right. I want to say a huge thank you to everybody who joined us live at VMX. Also, thank you to all of you out there who tuned into this episode. Thank you, Dr. Booth, for always being so willing to share your extensive knowledge of veterinary pharmacology, and to Boehringer Ingelheim for making this episode possible. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. I am told that it will help other veterinary professionals out there find more of the great content we try to put out there. I also want to note that there are handouts to accompany this talk that can be found on the VetFolio website, so if that'll help clarify some of these concepts that are admittedly complicated, definitely check those out. For more episodes like this, click on the Education tab on the VetFolio website. As always, we'd love to hear your input on this talk, as well as ideas for topics you'd like to hear from us in the future. Feel free to reach out to me at dvm@vetfolio.com. You can also visit my Facebook page at Dr. Cassie DVM, and you can find me on LinkedIn. And remember, if one animal is better off because of you today, it's a great day.